Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to go over the participation activity for dynamic issues with monopolies. This is for Chapter 14 in Public Economics and Regulation, where we're looking at dynamic issues with monopolies or dynamic issues and monopolies. And the big idea here when we're talking about dynamic issues with monopolies is the idea that monopolies can come and go. A market might move to a more monopolistic structure or away from it. And so what we're going to look at in this assignment is a market with one large average cost curve that we assume is identical for all firms. And we're going to talk about how different levels of demand and different changing costs might alter that market and make it more or less likely that a natural monopoly persists. And the reason we care about these things is that when there's a natural monopoly, we're going to have to engage in some kind of economic regulation, usually entry and exit, or price or quantity, in order to move that natural monopoly market closer to a competitive outcome. If that natural monopoly becomes less likely, we might want to partially or fully deregulate that market and step away to try and maintain or maximize welfare. And that's where all this comes from, right? All of this economic regulation is designed to enhance welfare by regulating these natural monopolies. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show you the assignment. Okay, so here we have the graph for, here's the assignment, right? And here's the graph for firm costs for an average firm with various levels of demand for the entire market for high-speed internet service. And so we're assuming that every firm in this market has this average cost curve and that there are lots of possible levels of demand. And so we want to look and see what might happen in terms of whether or not a natural monopoly persists. And really what this is getting at, this activity is getting at, is this idea of recognizing what the kind of solution is. Like, how do you solve a dynamic monopoly problem? Well, you find average cost, you find demand, and then you determine if we're at efficient scale, if we're on that downward sloping part of the average cost curve where we're experiencing economies of scale and we might experience a natural monopoly, or that upward sloping average cost part of the average cost curve where we will benefit in terms of welfare from having more firms produce the same amount of produce that quantity because more firms can do it at a lower cost. And that's really what we're getting to. So we're assuming all firms face this same AC curve. So this average cost is a function of quantity. And what we can see here is first we want to ask a simple question. How much does it cost to produce 1,000 units? So we go here and we see at demand curve crosses the average cost curve right here at 1,000 units. And that tells us that it costs $60 on average per unit to produce 1,000 units, right? Because here's that 1,000 units mark and here's that average cost curve. And that's telling us at a quantity or at a level of production of 1,000 units, it costs $60 per unit to produce. So far, so good, right? The next question says, according to the graph above, at which quantity is efficient scale achieved? And we want to remember here that efficient scale is achieved when average costs are minimized. And we have that point marked too. Of all these different quantities, the point where efficient scale exists, the point where average cost is minimized is right here at a quantity of 5,500 units. So let's go ahead and I'll put my answers in there just so we can keep track of all this. So it costs you could also do the math here for this first problem, right? $60 times 1,000 units is going to be $60,000, right? According to the graph above, efficient scale is achieved when average cost is minimized at Q equal to 5,500. And we do have a little bit of a flat-bottomed average cost curve here. And so we can imagine that there might be a little bit of a wider scope. It's not just that quantity. Anything generally within that range is okay. If you have a different answer, slightly different answer, it's not the end of the world. But you can see here at 4,000, at a quantity of 4,000, costs are still falling. And then over here at this quantity of 7,500, average costs are rising. And so those are not efficient scale points, right? Here's where we have economies of scale. Scale economies persist, and we can lower costs, maximize welfare by having one firm produce this quantity, right? Having an individual firm increase production. At efficient scale, we're getting those constant returns to scale. And then over here is when we start to have those increasing costs, that diseconomies of scale. And that's where we want firms to reduce production. And that's why we might see more firms enter the market and a natural monopoly be less likely. What is the cost of, number 3, what is the cost of a single firm producing at efficient scale? Well, that's one of the important things about efficient scale. Efficient scale is when the average cost is minimized. At that Q equal to 5,500 or 5,500 units. When a firm is producing those 5,500 units, it only costs them $25 per unit. That's the minimum cost, right? That's the lowest possible average cost. So at efficient scale, each unit costs only $25 to produce. And that's where we get some of that welfare maximization from this idea of whether we're in a natural monopoly or not, is that idea of cost minimization, producing the same quantity of goods or services at the lowest cost. Questions 4 and 5 are where we get into the dynamic component. And that's where we're going to talk about different demand curves and what we might see happen there. So suppose incomes rise, leading to higher demand for high-speed internet, and it increases to, suppose rising incomes lead to demand for high-speed internet increasing to D5. So we're going to be dealing with this demand curve here. At D5, is a natural monopoly present in the market? To determine that, we just need to know, are we before or after that efficient scale point? Efficient scale occurs at 5,500 units. So if we have customers double in efficient scale, go from 5,500 to 11,000, we do not see a natural monopoly present. At the very least, we can minimize costs by having 2 firms produce that quantity. Does that make sense? If costs are minimized by one firm producing 5,500 or internet for 5,500 households, if demand is over here at 11,000, by doubling the number of firms, by having 2 firms each produce 5,500 units of internet, high-speed internet, we can actually minimize costs, lower costs from $40 to $25. And that's going to be welfare maximizing. So there is not a natural monopoly present. How many firms would maximize welfare and minimize costs? At that demand 5, it's going to be 2 firms. 2 firms would minimize costs to that $25 and maximize welfare. Okay. The last question asks, basically what would happen if we saw costs decrease? So new technology reduces the fixed costs associated with producing this good. We only have one average cost curve up here. So now we're going to be a little bit more theoretical and think about what that might mean. And so what I'm going to do is bring that to the board and show you what we kind of expect when we see fixed costs go down. So we want to know how this is going to affect the average cost curve generally, and how this would affect the likelihood of a natural monopoly generally. So let's go to the whiteboard. So this graph is actually up from our last lecture, but I'm going to go over it a different way. But you can kind of see what happens here. This is from the book, where this is one of the examples where we had 3 cost curves and 3 demand curves. And one was the initial demand curve and cost curve. And this was talking about looking at the telecom industry and saying, okay, when costs went down, when we talked about going from coax cable to radio transmissions for phone calls, did we see average costs go down by a little or by a lot? And when incomes rose and the rise of new telecom needs rose and increased demand, did we see demand go up by a little or a lot? And these are the kinds of general questions that economists want to answer when they decide whether or not to deregulate and how much to deregulate, right? Partial or full deregulation. So that's the basic question we're asking with this last problem on the participation activity. If we've got this cost curve here, where we're seeing, try and get it about like that. Cost was minimized at 5,500 units. Should be using a smaller pen. And we saw that was at a cost of $25 per unit. What we can expect from a change in fixed costs, first of all, the second question is the easiest question to ask. Is it going to make a natural monopoly more or less likely generally? Less likely. Less likely because high fixed costs drive natural monopolies. When we think about the natural monopolies we encounter, they usually tend to face really high fixed costs. Think about all of our utilities. Water requires laying down pipe to house to house to house. Electricity, same thing, running wires from house to house to house. Huge upfront fixed costs and then really low per unit costs. Those are the driving forces of a natural monopoly. So if we see a decrease in fixed costs, that's going to decrease the probability or the likelihood of a natural monopoly. Generally. What it's going to do to the average cost curve? Two things: lower it and shrink it. And that's because those high fixed costs are driving that high level of efficient scale. If you think about fixed costs and variable costs, if there's some high fixed cost, let's say fixed costs are, $1,000 and variable costs are $1, then total cost is going to be $1,100 for, say, the first household. If variable costs are really, really low, and we're looking at now the average total cost, we're going to want to get to, say, 100 houses to try and absorb that $1,000 of fixed costs while variable costs still stay relatively low. So now we want to get $1,100 divided by 100 rather than $1,001 divided by 1. Does that kind of make sense? When fixed costs are really high, increasing the quantity is going to mean that we're dividing them out over more and more households, and that's going to get us closer to efficient scale. If instead we cut fixed costs down, that's going to mean we can get to that efficient scale point a lot faster. So, lower fixed costs are going to mean an average cost curve that looks something more like that has a smaller efficient scale, maybe I'm just making up numbers here, and a lower average cost. And that's generally what we expect to happen when fixed costs fall. So now we see, okay, we went from efficient scale happens at 5,500 households and $25. Now efficient scale happens at only $1,010. Something like that. Generally, these numbers came from nowhere. I'm just making them up, but that gives us a sense of what we expect. And that makes sense. Right now, demand doesn't have to be nearly as high for us to imagine multiple firms. If we think about that demand where we were going to have 2 firms in play, that was over here, D5, where we had 1,100 households demanding internet. If we experience this green AC average cost curve and demand 5 over here, where we have 1,100 households demand, or 11,000 households demanding high-speed internet, and efficient scale for a given firm is 1,000 households, we could have 11 firms. That's not a natural monopoly. That's getting close to a pretty competitive market, right? That's way more competitive than the average high-speed internet marketplace. So that's why we see an average cost curve shrinking because of lower fixed costs is going to decrease the likelihood of a natural monopoly. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't. Let me know what questions you have. Hopefully this clears up what we're talking about. If this were to happen and we ended up with this average cost curve and this demand, then we would have a choice. We'd say, okay, we can have 11 firms now producing this quantity, right? So maybe we'll have 11 firms producing it. Maybe we don't need to regulate price anymore. Maybe we could just regulate entry and exit. Maybe some kind of deregulation, partial or full deregulation would take place. And that's what we would see happen when we might have previously had in our initial case, maybe with D1, a natural monopoly. Now we no longer see a natural monopoly present. And that's that dynamic thing, right? This movement through this changing cost curves and these changing demand curves. That's what we mean by dynamic. So hopefully that clears it up. Let me know what questions you have, and I will see you all next time. Have a great day.